He had always believed he was just a poor mechanic, but at their wedding, he finally revealed his true identity. The rain gently fell, soft enough to blur the edges of the morning. Olivia tightened her grip on the steering wheel as her car jolted forward, only to stop entirely in the middle of a strange residential street. She groaned, turned on the hazard lights, and checked her phone. Of course, there was no signal. She stepped out and pulled her coat tighter around her. The neighborhood was quiet, well-kept hedges, closed windows, and no one in sight. She glanced down the street, hoping to find a gas station, a garage, or anything that could help. Then, she heard the faint sound of metal clinking nearby. Following the noise, she turned down a side street and found a man crouched beside an old red sedan. An elderly woman stood with a polka-dot umbrella, watching him with a soft, endearing gaze. The man worked silently, his arms covered in grease, his gray t-shirt damp from the rain. There was something grounded about him, calm yet steady, deliberate. "Excuse me," Olivia called as she approached. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my car broke down back there. I think it's the engine or something." The woman smiled warmly. "You're lucky, Brian. Here's one of the good ones. He's helped me more times than I can count." Brian stood, wiping his hands on a rag. He was in his early 30s, with damp hair sticking to his forehead and calm brown eyes that met hers without hesitation. "I'll take a look," he said simply. He grabbed a toolkit from his car trunk and followed her without asking questions. Olivia walked beside him, noticing his quiet yet intentional presence. Not cold, just purposeful. Within minutes, Brian had the hood of her car up, sleeves rolled up, and his face focused in concentration. The rain poured harder, but he barely reacted. Olivia watched in awe as his hands moved with ease, each tool seeming like an extension of himself. "Your alternator's weak," he said after a moment. "I've adjusted it so you can make it where you're going, but it won't hold for long. You'll need to replace it soon." "Did you fix it that fast?" Olivia asked, astounded. Brian nodded as he wiped his hands. "It's a temporary fix, but it'll get you there." "Thank you. Really, let me pay you for your time." He shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." "No, I insist," she said, reaching into her purse. "You just saved my morning." "I don't do this for tips," he said gently. "Just make sure to check your brakes every couple of months. Don't let your car become more important than you." Something in his tone, firm yet kind, made her stop. She nodded. He handed her a small oil streak card. Written neatly were a name, a phone number, and two simple words: Garage 47. "Thank you," Olivia said softly. Brian nodded and turned back to the woman under the umbrella, who gave Olivia a knowing smile. In her car, the engine started on the first try. She sat for a moment, watching the rain bead on the windshield. The card lay in her lap. There was no website, no business slogan, just a name, a number, and something she couldn't quite put into words. Something different. That evening, she found herself reading the card again. Garage 47. She tucked it into her purse, though she wasn't sure why. 3 days later, she drove across town to the address she had traced from the number. The shop was tucked between a laundromat and a diner, with a crooked sign and wind chimes made of spark plugs. The open bay smelled of oil and metal. Brian was there, kneeling beside a truck, tightening a bolt. His shirt was covered in fresh grease. When he looked up and saw her, he didn't seem surprised. He smiled faintly. "Car trouble again?" he asked. Olivia shook her head. "Not this time. I just wanted to thank you properly." For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Over the next few weeks, Olivia found herself returning to Garage 47 more often than necessary. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes pastries, once even a homemade sandwich that she insisted was too much for one lunch, but always ended up in Brian's hands. He never asked questions, never pushed. He simply greeted her with that quiet smile and always made time for a brief chat, even if only for 5 minutes. Between brake pads and oil changes, they began sharing more about life, not just cars. Olivia spoke about her job in marketing, how it often felt like running in place with a smile. Brian listened, offering thoughtful responses here and there, but mostly just being there, which was more than she was used to. He shared little about himself, mostly stories from the garage or his old neighborhood, but Olivia didn't press. It was enough just to exist together in the quiet spaces. Brian lived simply. His clothes were simple, worn from years of use. The apartment above the garage was modest and tidy, filled with items that clearly held sentimental value. Old tools from his father, black and white photos, and well-worn books. He never boasted, never discussed money, and never acted as if he was trying to impress anyone. Instead, he spent his days fixing what was broken and his nights helping others with their own repairs. Olivia soon discovered that Brian frequently fixed cars for elderly people in the neighborhood, never charging them a penny. He even kept an unofficial list of single mothers who couldn't afford maintenance, showing up on weekends to top off fluids, change wipers, or rotate tires. "Why do you do it?" she asked one day, genuinely curious. He shrugged, wiping grease from his hands. "Because I can. Some people need their cars just to get by. It costs me time, not my character." Those words stayed with her. It wasn't just about what he did. It was how he did it, quietly, without seeking recognition. Olivia had dated successful men before, lawyers, entrepreneurs, even a man with a private jet. But none of them had ever looked at her the way Brian did when she was talking about how much she hated Monday mornings or shared her favorite childhood memory as if it were the most important thing he'd ever heard. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She could breathe around him. The real turning point came when Olivia casually mentioned that her mother's kitchen was falling apart. Her mother lived in a small, aging house on the outskirts of town. The cabinets were warped, the sink leaked, and the floor tiles were coming loose. It had been on their someday list for years. Brian just nodded. 2 Saturdays later, he showed up at her mom's door with a toolbox, plywood, and a smile. Olivia was astonished. "You're serious? Tell me where to start." It took 3 weekends. Olivia helped where she could, passing tools, sanding cabinets, fetching snacks. But it was Brian who did the heavy work. He stayed late, arrived early, and never once complained. He refused payment. He wouldn't even let her mother cook him dinner in return. "This is my thank you," he said one evening, screwing in the last cabinet door, "for raising someone who makes Tuesday afternoons feel like Christmas morning." That night, as Brian packed up his tools and headed to his truck, Olivia's mother stood beside her in the doorway, watching him. She leaned in and whispered, "You should hold on to that one. Sweetheart, men like him don't come around twice." Olivia didn't reply. She couldn't. Her throat tightened, her heart too full. Later, as they stood in the driveway, Brian leaned against his truck, gazing at the quiet street. "You don't have to thank me," he said, almost as if reading her thoughts. "But I want to," she whispered. He turned to her, eyes soft under the streetlight's glow. "Then just don't leave." And she didn't. From that moment on, Olivia knew something had changed. This wasn't casual anymore. It wasn't about excitement or charm, or even romance. It was about home. And somehow, without her realizing it, she had found hers in the calloused hands and steady silence of a man who never needed to be anything more than himself. It was supposed to be a simple surprise. Olivia had finished work early and picked up Brian's favorite cinnamon bread from the small bakery 2 blocks from Garage 47. She smiled to herself as she walked up the gravel driveway, the scent of grease and rain-soaked pavement oddly comforting after the day she'd had. She wanted to see his face light up, hear his low laugh, feel the warmth she had grown so attached to over the past few months. But as she turned the corner toward the garage entrance, she stopped short. Brian wasn't alone. Standing just outside the open bay was a man in a black suit, tailored, expensive-looking. His shoes gleamed despite the dirt. His hair was cut short and styled with the precision of someone who likely never changed their own oil. His presence fell out of place, sharp, deliberate. Brian stood in front of him, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, serious, controlled, but focused in a way Olivia had never seen. He nodded once, then glanced toward the alley where Olivia stood frozen. Their eyes met. Brian's jaw twitched slightly. The man in the suit turned. not seeming to notice her. He handed Brian a sleek black briefcase, whispered something too quiet to hear, and then stepped into a black car idling at the curb. The car glided away, disappearing like a ghost. Brian looked back at Olivia. She blinked and forced a small smile. "Hey," she said, her voice thinner than she expected. He stepped forward slowly, almost too casually. "Hey, you're early." She held up the bakery bag. "Thought I'd surprise you." Brian nodded. "Just give me a moment to finish up here. I'll be right there." Olivia nodded, kissed his cheek, and walked into the garage apartment above, her smile still firmly in place. She didn't ask about the man. She didn't ask about the briefcase. Not yet, but the question lingered. Something about the interaction, about the way Brian had stiffened when he saw her, unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. That evening, as they sat across from each other eating takeout, she observed him more closely than usual. He was polite, affectionate even, but there was distance in him, a certain distraction. He checked his phone more than once, and didn't meet her eyes as often as before. When he stepped outside to make a call, Olivia's heart raced with a guilt she couldn't push away. She wasn't the type to snoop, but tonight felt different. She quietly walked to the far corner of the apartment, where Brian often kept tools and random supplies behind an old shelf. The briefcase was there, half hidden under a tarp. It was unlocked. Her breath caught as she gently lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash. Bundles of bills, not hundreds, but thousands, possibly tens of thousands, organized in rows. Olivia's blood turned cold. She backed away, slowly closing the lid, staring at it in disbelief. This didn't make sense. Nothing about Brian, his life, or his behavior aligned with this. Unless it did. Her mind raced. The man in the suit, the way Brian had been evasive, the fact that she still knew almost nothing about his past. No family visits, no social media, no detailed history he'd ever shared. The man who never asked for anything had just been handed a suitcase full of untraceable money. Her thoughts spiraled into darker possibilities. Drugs? Money laundering? Some illegal network? Had she fallen for a man who was only pretending to be the good guy? She couldn't sleep. Every creak of the apartment made her jump. Brian came back an hour later, kissed her forehead, and lay down beside her. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, her mind shouting in the silence. By 3 a.m., she made her decision. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake him, grabbed her phone and keys, and slipped out the front door. She didn't leave a note. She couldn't explain something she didn't understand. She just ran back to her apartment, to the questions, to the fear that she had loved someone whose truth was built on lies. She blocked his number, deleted their photos, and tried to forget the way his arms felt around her, the softness of his voice when he said her name. But none of it worked, because none of it had ever felt fake. And that, more than anything, terrified her the most. Olivia sat curled up on Mia's couch, her hands gripping a steaming mug of tea she hadn't touched. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her voice hoarse from whispering everything that had happened. The briefcase, the man in the suit, the money, the silence. Mia listened without interrupting, then sat back and said carefully, "Are you sure it was full of cash?" "I saw it," Olivia said. "It was open. It wasn't a guess." "And you don't think he could be involved in something that's not illegal, like a business deal?" "I don't know. That's the problem. I thought I knew him, Mia. He fixes cars, gives free oil changes to elderly women, brings me soup when I'm sick. But that man yesterday, and the way Brian looked when he saw me, it was like he was someone else." That night, they pulled out their laptops and began searching. They tried everything. Brian plus Garage 47. Brian plus local mechanic. Brian plus the phone number on the card, his last name, which he had only mentioned once. They combed through public records, social media, background search tools. Nothing. No photos, no business licenses, no tax records tied to his name. It was as if he didn't exist. Mia leaned back, frowning. Okay, this is creepy. Like, actually creepy. No paper trail at all? That's not normal. Olivia stared at the screen, her heart racing. What if he's not even Brian? She whispered. What if the name is fake? What if everything he told me was a cover story? I mean, why else would he have that kind of money just lying around? Why is there no record of him anywhere? The more she thought about it, the worse it seemed. Every detail, the lack of social media, the reluctance to talk about his past, the fact that he lived alone above a garage, began to take on a darker meaning. Had she missed the signs? Had she let her guard down because he was kind? Because he had soft eyes and calloused hands? But the Brian she knew had never once made her feel unsafe. Never once. But maybe that was a trick. Maybe it was a perfect disguise. Across town, Brian sat alone in his apartment, staring at the wall where Olivia's coat used to hang. The briefcase was still there, untouched. She hadn't taken anything. She had just disappeared. His calls went straight to voicemail. His messages were undelivered, unread. He had checked every place she might have gone. Her office, the bookstore she loved, the little pier where she liked to sketch. Nothing. No note. No goodbye. Only absence. He had replayed their last conversation 100 times, trying to find what shifted. The moment her eyes changed, the way her voice trembled, he saw the wall go up, but it was already too late. He couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not when it would only bring more questions and comfort. Not when he was still trying to figure out how much of his past should stay hidden, and how much could be shared without unraveling everything. But now she was gone and the silence was unbearable. He opened his laptop, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and began to type. I understand, Olivia, if you are reading this. Thank you. I do not know where you are or what you are thinking, but I know you are scared. I felt it. I saw it. I caused it. I am sorry. The briefcase, it is not what you think. But I also know you have no reason to believe me now. You have every right to seek answers. You deserve them. Perhaps I was wrong to wait so long. Maybe I was trying to protect something that should have been revealed. If you choose never to speak to me again, I will understand. But before you decide who I truly am, please know this. I never lied to hurt you. I never entered your life to manipulate it. You were the first person who saw me without expecting more. You made me believe that I could live with honesty. If you're afraid, I will let you go. But if you're not, come back. I will show you everything. Brian. He hit send, aware that it could be the last message she ever received from him. And then he sat quietly, surrounded by the silence of someone who once thought he was simply a good man with a wrench, not someone hiding a past that could cost him everything, especially her. The last person Olivia ever expected to see that Saturday morning was Brian. She had come to the community fundraiser out of obligation. A work friend had invited her, and she had agreed just to be polite. She wasn't in the mood for the cheerful music, the colorful booths, or the smiling volunteers. Her heart still ached in places she couldn't name. But as she wandered past tables filled with raffles and bake sales, her eyes landed on a group of children near a small tent labeled Rebuild. Volunteers were helping fit kids with prosthetic limbs, custom painted brightly with stickers and superheroes. A boy in a wheelchair beamed as a young man helped him attach a bright red prosthetic arm. It was Brian. He was kneeling on the grass, focused, gentle, laughing softly as he adjusted the fit. He seemed different somehow, lighter and heavier at the same time. There was something in his eyes that pulled at her in ways she didn't want to feel. Again, he looked up and froze. Their eyes locked across the crowd. Olivia hesitated, her breath catching. She could have turned and walked away, but she didn't. Her feet moved before her mind did. Brian stood slowly as she approached. For a moment, neither of them spoke. You look well, he said quietly. So do you, she replied. Another pause. Then Olivia spoke, before she could lose her nerve. Was it real? Brian blinked. What? What we had before the briefcase. Before the silence. Was it real? Or just part of some version of you I wasn't supposed to know about? Brian looked down, hands in his pockets. It was the only real thing I've had in years. Then tell me the truth, she said, her voice now firm. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Come with me. They drove in silence. Brian took her to the edge of town, down a winding road that led to a modest single-story house surrounded by trees. It was quiet, unremarkable. Nothing about it screamed secret wealth or danger. Inside, it was warm, filled with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with old books and framed letters. In the corner stood a table covered with documents, donor envelopes, and photos of smiling children from various parts of the country. "This is where the money goes," Brian said softly. "The briefcase, the trust." Olivia stepped closer, scanning the photos. Kids with new arms and legs, mothers holding thank you signs, clinics in rural towns with handmade banners. "I started it 5 years ago," he continued. "Anonymous. Quiet. I didn't want my name on it. I didn't want it to be about me." Her throat tightened. Then why the garage? Why the secrecy? He sat down on the edge of a worn couch, finally meeting her eyes. "Because I was raised with money I never earned. Because I was told that helping people only mattered if your name was on a plaque. And I hated that. I wanted to know who I was without all the noise, without the legacy. I chose the garage because it was honest. Every fix, every smile, every scraped knuckle, it was mine, not inherited, not bought." Olivia swallowed hard. "And the man in the suit?" "My lawyer," Brian said. "The trust is managed under a different name. He brings cash withdrawals every quarter, enough to fund each branch of the project. I didn't want it traced back to me." There was silence for a moment. Then he added quietly, "I'm not a poor mechanic, Olivia, but I've never wanted to live off money I didn't earn. I've been trying to rebuild something, starting with myself." She sat beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of a photo. "You could have told me. I wanted to. But by the time I realized you mattered more than a lie, it felt too late." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, uninvited and persistent. "I left because I was scared," she whispered. "Not of you. Of finding out I didn't really know the person I gave my heart to." Brian reached out gently, taking her hand. "I never wanted to be someone you had to figure out. I just wanted to be someone who was enough without a title." "And maybe you are," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "Maybe you always were." In that little house, filled with quiet proof of who he truly was, the space between them finally felt honest again. Not perfect, not easy, but true. The ride back from the small house was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. Olivia sat beside Brian, staring out the window, her thoughts racing, her heart softening with each passing mile. The anger she had felt was gone. What replaced it was something far more humbling. Shame. Shame for assuming the worst about someone who had only ever shown her the best version of himself. Brian hadn't begged her to stay. He hadn't tried to explain away her fears. He simply showed her the truth and let her make her own decision. When they reached the edge of town, he pulled over near the same street where they had first met, the same sidewalk where she had stood, helpless and flustered, with a broken car and a rain-soaked coat. He turned off the engine, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment. "If you want to walk away again," he said gently, "I won't stop you." Olivia turned to look at him. His eyes were steady, but there was a quiet sorrow in them that hurt more than any accusation. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he continued, "not even your forgiveness. But if you do want to keep going, if you want to try again, then take my hand like you did the first day we met." He reached out, not in desperation, but with hope. Olivia looked down at his hand. Rough, scarred, familiar. She took it without saying a word. They sat there for a while, hand in hand, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. A month passed. Slowly, gently, they rebuilt. Olivia returned to the garage, not just to bring coffee, but to sit nearby and sketch while Brian worked. They shared quiet lunches on the tailgate of his truck. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Brian never pressed. He was just there, steady, patient, real. That steadiness was what allowed her heart to come back to life, piece by piece. One evening, Brian invited her to a charity gala hosted by his organization. It was a simple event in a repurposed barn outside the city, lit by string lights with soft music and tables lined with handmade crafts and silent auction items. Olivia wore a navy dress, Brian a jacket, no tie, still boots. They looked like themselves, just a little more polished. As the night wound down, Brian took the stage. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice calm and warm. This project started quietly. I never wanted it to be about credit. But tonight, I'd like to use this moment for something personal. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Olivia's breath caught. He looked at her directly. The first time I met Olivia, she was stranded on the side of the road. Her car stalled, her face looking like the world had ended. She didn't ask for help. She apologized for needing it. Laughter fluttered around the room. I gave her a note with the name Garage 47 and thought I'd never see her again. But she came back. He stepped off the stage and walked toward her, pulling something from his jacket pocket. When he reached her, he knelt, not grandly, just with quiet purpose. Olivia, the first time I met you, your hand was shaking because your brakes were bad. Today, if your hands are shaking, let it be because you're nervous about forever, and let me hold them every day of it. He opened his hand. No ring, no box, just a folded piece of paper. The same kind as his old garage card. In the same handwriting, it read, Still Garage 47. Still yours if you'll have me. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. I've always been yours. They embraced as a room filled with soft applause and gentle music, holding each other under the glow of barn lights, like they were finally exactly where they belonged. The garden behind the Hearts and Hands headquarters had been transformed into a peaceful haven. Wildflowers lined the path. String lights hung between the trees, and wooden chairs faced a small altar beneath an old oak tree. Olivia stood beneath it, her white dress catching the golden light. Her hair was tucked with lavender. No veil, no train, just a ribbon around her waist, soft and sincere. Brian stood across from her, gray vest and sleeves rolled, his smile steady. He looked like the man who had fixed her brakes, and somehow also the man who had healed her. The guests weren't executives or VIPs. They were people Brian had helped, an elderly woman with a walker, a boy with a new prosthetic arm, teenage mechanics, volunteers. People whose lives had been touched not by wealth but by care. The ceremony began with honest vows. Olivia promised to listen, even in frustration. Brian promised to tell the truth, even when it was hard. They vowed to keep choosing each other. They were not pledging for who they once were, but for who they were becoming. Then the officiant paused and turned to Brian. Before I pronounce you husband and wife, Brian has something he'd like to say. Brian took Olivia's hands. I never wanted this day to be about who I was. I wanted it to be about who we are, what we've built. He turned to the guests. For most of you, I've been Brian the mechanic, the guy who fixed your car or forgot to bill you. But what many of you don't know is that I'm the founder of this organization, and I'm still the chairman of the board. A soft gasp spread through the crowd. I kept it quiet because I needed to know who I was without the noise. I left a life of legacy and expectation to build something real. I wanted to serve without needing my name etched in stone. He looked back at Olivia. I didn't want you to love the man behind the title. I wanted you to love the hands that fixed your brakes, the heart that burned toast and got grease on your kitchen chair. Soft laughter rolled through the guests. I want to be chosen not for what I have, but for who I'm trying to be. He pulled a folded note from his pocket and read, To the girl who made a mechanic feel like a king, you are the reason I found my way back to myself. The officiant smiled, voice warm. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Brian, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was slow, full of promise. As they turned the crowd, hand in hand, Olivia whispered, You never had to prove anything. Brian smiled. Maybe not, but I needed you to know everything and still stay. Always, she said. The rest of the afternoon was filled with laughter. Barefoot kids dancing the grass, elders raising lemonade and toast, and stories shared under the trees. Olivia looked around and saw the quiet legacy Brian had built, not with wealth, but with love. And as they walked past the rows of wildflowers and lanterns, she thought back to the first day when all he gave her was a card, Garage 47. And somehow, that had been more than enough. 1 year later, the life Brian and Olivia had built together was not one of grand headlines or lavish travels, but one filled with rhythm, purpose, and peace. They lived in a modest wooden house on the edge of town, tucked beneath a canopy of tall pines and surrounded by the kind of quiet that let them hear birds before sunrise. It was a kind of home where the porch creaked when you stepped on it and the windows fogged slightly in the morning, where everything felt lived in, warm and real. Brian still worked with his hands. He kept Garage 47 open on weekends, not because he needed the money, but because he loved the work. He fixed brakes for single moms, replaced radiators for old friends, and spent his Saturday mornings running free technical classes for teenagers who might not have had a father figure or steady hand in their lives. Olivia opened a small interior design studio just down the road, a community-focused space where people from all walks of life could come and get advice on turning small rooms into sanctuaries. Her favorite projects were the affordable ones: shelter spaces, single-bedroom apartments, homes for quiet warriors just like Brian. She believed everyone deserved to live in beauty, even on a budget. Each evening, no matter how busy their day had been, they paused. They made tea, sat on the porch or by the fireplace depending on the weather, and read aloud thank you notes from people Brian had helped. Handwritten letters, sometimes in awkward cursive, sometimes type of precision, but always heartfelt. One night, a letter came from a boy named Marcus who had attended one of Brian's free classes and was now enrolled in a technical college. Another came from a grandmother who said the car Brian had fixed allowed her to visit her late husband's grave every Sunday. Olivia saved every one of them, tucking them into a large box that sat on the coffee table. They were never tired of being surprised by the kindness they had helped inspire, and though their world was simple, it was full of meaning and joy, especially in each other's company. Their wedding photo hung above the mantel, framed in rustic oak, next to a small glass case that visitors often asked about. Inside it was the old black briefcase. It now sat empty, slightly scuffed at the corners but polished clean and locked shut. Resting atop it, mounted with brass nameplate, was a small plaque that read, "IT wasn't money that changed US." It was truth. People who knew the story would smile quietly when they read it. Others would ask. Olivia would always smile, sometimes shrug, and say, "It's a long story, but a good one." Sometimes they retold it, about the girl who thought her brakes were failing, and met a man who showed her what it meant to slow down, to trust, to build love one bolt and promise at a time. Sometimes they said nothing and just held each other as the fire crackled, content in the silence they had once feared. They never stopped choosing each other, not because it was always easy, but because it was always worth it. And every time Olivia glanced at that photo, the one where Brian had a smear of grease on his collar, and she had tears caught in the corner of her smile, she remembered that love, and real love, had never needed to be loud to be lasting. It only needed to be honest. Sometimes love isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it's found in the quiet strength of someone who fixes more than just broken things. Someone who offers not just their hands, but their truth, their healing, and their whole heart. Brian and Olivia's story reminds us that real love is built, not bought, that trust, once broken, can still be mended, and that even the heaviest secrets, when shared with courage, can lead to the most beautiful beginnings. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to Soul Stirring Stories, where we share powerful emotional tales that remind us of the beauty in honesty, resilience, and love that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Subscribe now and let your heart be stirred one story at a time.